Welcome back, everybody, for episode 4 in our second part of our series on the Socialist Party of America. We looked at the prehistory last time. We're going to look at the Socialist Party of America on its own terms today. Reed's going to take us through this for the most part, and we're going to look at it through three main areas that are brought up in that article we referenced last time from the RCP, formerly the IMT. We're going to look at the organizational question, the racism question, and the industrial unions question. We'll save the downfall of the SPA and the questions of internationalism and how did it fit into the kind of broader international picture of socialism for the next episode.
Last time I kind of gave a little bit of a crash course on the history of the working class movement or movements in the United States, specifically political, as well as kind of some general remarks on perspective of Marx and Engels had on some of those questions. We got to around the end of the 19th century, but just to kind of finish things off a little bit, we discussed how in the post-Civil War period, the first international, the International Working Men's Association, had been relocated to the United States, and out of that grew the beginnings of modern working class political movement in the United States. In the immediate post-Civil War period, you have the formation of what was called the National Labor Union, which was an attempt to kind of form an umbrella organization of labor organizations, but also was aspiring towards a political organization of the working class before its sort of untimely demise. And that was kind of affiliated with the First International. This is in the 1860s, the latter part of the 1860s. In the 1870s, you get a move towards a more socialist-led political organization, kind of doctrinaire Lassalleans and Marxists around this First International remnant that's in the United States, trying to sort of form a political party that culminates in the formation of what was first called the Working Men's Party of the United States and then the Socialist Labor Party in the late 1870s. And then in the 1880s, you have this struggle of this group to kind of really achieve a kind of political coherence, a kind of meaningful existence as an organization, as a political organization. It's really more of a kind of a sectarian organization in a lot of respects, which led Marx and Engels to not have a particularly high opinion of it at the time. In the 1880s, you have this kind of rise of the Knights of Labor, which is kind of a hybrid between what we would think of as like a modern labor union and not exactly a political organization. It wasn't political in the sense of running candidates for office or anything like that, but it had more of a kind of a utopian, almost a kind of quasi-utopian character to it. It was aspiring to establish the so-called the cooperative commonwealth, which was another way of thinking about socialism, essentially. Although maybe a somewhat backward conception of socialism in some respects, a kind of artisanal, small producer style of socialism, as opposed to kind of industrial capitalism, these large accumulations of centralized systems of production with a working class dependent on wage labor to survive. Um, and the Knights of Labor was sort of it was a very heterogeneous organization. I won't say much about it here. I talked a little bit about it last time. But there were all sorts of different tendencies at work within it, and the kind of Socialist Labor Party was attempting to influence it and get a kind of foothold in it. One of the most significant moments in this kind of period is the formation of the United, I believe, the United Labor Party in New York around Henry George's campaign for governor I mentioned last time, which Knights of Labor chapters were involved in, as was the Socialist Labor Party. But by the end of the 1880s, the Knights of Labor is in decline. The AFL had formed, the kind of beginnings of a more modern industrial labor movement, although it's still not quite what we would today maybe think of as a modern labor movement, in terms of industrial unions that attempt to organize all of the employees in an industry into one union. It still definitely had more of a quasi artisanal kind of guild like character in terms of its mode of organization, organizing around distinct the distinct skills or craft affiliations of its members. And it had a much the AFL had a much more sort of uh, often referred to as a kind of a bread and butter orientation, more concerned with achieving kind of concrete, meaningful gains for its members, as opposed to having some sort of vision of a different form of society that would be realized. Um, and the AFL begins to kind of take on a more significant role in the 1890s, as well as its member unions, as the Knights of Labor is declining. Um, and it's in this period also the Socialist Labor Party kind of is sort of in crisis, and it's at this point that Daniel De Leon, who again we mentioned last time, kind of becomes its leading figure, a sort of doctrinaire. He's a sort of a doctrinaire Marxist who kind of transforms Marxist theory into something at a remove from Marx and Engels' own political understanding, in turning it into the basis of this kind of sectarian organization. And again, this is something we discussed last time, so I won't elaborate further. But now we're in the 1890s, and in the 1890s, there's a few significant things going on to consider. One is the formation of the populist movement or the People's Party movement, which is um, a kind of a labor and farmer political movement, although more emphasis on the small farmer side of things, significantly more emphasis on that side of things. But it does have support from, for example, remnants of the Knights of Labor, and not so much from AFL unions, but there is some degree of contact there. And the SLP is attempting to have an influence on this as well. Um, I'm not going to say a whole lot about the populist movement. That would be a party of that would be an episode of its own. But needless to say, it's an expression of a kind of a democratic radicalism, a kind of small proprietor democratic radicalism, a kind of last gasp of a sort of 19th century American democratic movement. Going back to like the Jeffersonian period. Um, and also in this period, there is increasing, going back to the 1870s and 1880s, but around, into the 1890s, there's increasingly large scale and intense pitched battles between labor and capital in the field of industry in the form of large scale strikes, especially around the growth of the railroads. So going all the way back to 1877, there's a massive nationwide railroad strike sometimes called the Great Upheaval. There's further railroad strikes in the 1880s, and Eugene Debs, who had begun his career as a kind of labor leader, although he didn't really like that term, in the 1870s as an organizer for one of the kind of craft unions associated with railroad labor, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. Firemen being the people that kind of broke the coal and threw it into the furnace in the train. They're not like firemen fighting fires. Um, and he was sort of affiliated with this kind of style of unionism that as I was describing, became more associated with the AFL, although the railroad brotherhoods were separate from the AFL. And they had, not unlike the Knights of Labor, in terms of their modus operandi, they were more oriented towards kind of a fraternal organization, kind of benevolent societies, sort of mutual aid for their members, kind of insurance for their members, that sort of thing. It wasn't so oriented towards like collective bargaining, and certainly not strike activity. There was a kind of a general sense of strike activity as being unnecessary, introducing unnecessary hostility into the negotiations between labor and capital, whereas the goal should be to kind of lift labor up to the level that it can bargain on the same terms as capital. And again, this is a period where capital is not yet what we would now think of it as, this kind of monolithic accumulation of wealth. It's still this growing disparity between owners and employees, whereas previously there was much more of a heterogeneous producing class, some elements of which would rise above others, but in which there wasn't necessarily a kind of stark division between employers and employed, right? There was kind of a kind of circulation, a kind of, if you were an employee, you might become an employer, right? Um, so Debs, in the course of the 1880s, becomes more and more kind of alienated by this kind of, let's say, less class struggle oriented style of unionism, and instead begins to kind of see the necessity of strike activity and a kind of more of a kind of a class struggle orientation. And this culminates in the early 1890s when he tries to push the railroad brotherhoods to form what would we would now think of as an industrial union. He's in a sense organizing all of the railroad workers together in one union as opposed to having separate unions for all the different functions, all the different crafts associated um, with the railroad. So that ends up coming to grief due to the resistance of the leadership of the railroad brotherhoods, and Debs instead organizes what he called the American Railway Union, which was a union open to membership for all railroad employees. And the American Railroad Union has a short but very significant career. Almost immediately after its founding, it has a kind of remarkable victory in the Great Northern Railroad strike of 1894. But the same year, in 1894, there is a strike in Chicago, and so there's this kind of company town called Pullman, owned and operated by the Pullman Railcar Company. Just skipping over a lot of the details for the sake of brevity, this strike that is originally just a strike of the workers for this company in this town ends up becoming a cause for the American Railroad Union or American Railway Union, and they end up kind of boycotting any Pullman cars, and that spreads and becomes a kind of nationwide railroad strike. And it is an extremely significant moment in American labor history for a number of reasons. But Debs is kind of identified as this kind of leader of a kind of mass working class uprising. And this is, again, a period of large scale labor struggles across the country in different industries. And this becomes a kind of a moment, a kind of a spotlight is put on Debs as this kind of villain, this kind of enemy of civilization, as he's kind of characterized in the kind of mainstream press, but as a kind of heroic leader of the working class. And what ends up happening is that the strike is broken through the use of an injunction by the Supreme Court, and the federal government sends in troops to suppress the strike. And so it's at this moment that Debs begins to realize that not only is it necessary to overcome these craft divisions between the organizations of the working class that are weakening it and preventing the workers from kind of succeeding in their struggles. You know, he recognizes the need for political organization of the working class. So it's not enough to have trade unions, because if the struggles of the workers are going to be suppressed by political power, then they ought to have struggle for political power themselves. And while he's in the Woodstock jail after, he's put in jail after the strike, he's introduced to he was already somewhat familiar with the ideas of some socialist ideas that were kind of in the air, over the previous decade or so. But it's in the Woodstock jail that Victor Berger, an American Marxist, brings him, famously, the story goes, he brings him Marx's Capital, gives him Marx's Capital to read in jail, but also the works of Kautsky, Karl Kautsky. And Debs leaves the Woodstock jail a kind of converted socialist. So I recount that story because the American Railway Union is essentially destroyed after the strike, after the Pullman strike. But Debs comes out with not only, and I'm using Debs as kind of a character here, but imagine how many people across the country, how many workers across the country are looking at what happened with Debs, and especially the ones that are directly affected, the ones that are now blacklisted, that can't get employment anymore. But that's also kind of a setting an example for workers across the country and in various industries of what could happen to you. Um, so Debs becomes this kind of figurehead um, for for this kind of crucial turning point in the history of the American labor movement. Now, the next year or 2 years, in 1896, the populist movement, the People's Party movement, which Debs kind of supportive of, and it's not like a he's not like a full on populist ideologically or something like that, whatever that might mean, but he's supportive of the People's Party movement. And they had ran a candidate for president in 1892. In 1896, so just after this event with the Pullman strike, the Populist Party nominates for president the candidate for the Democratic Party, William Jennings Bryan, who is a kind of a speaker who does the rounds in populist circles, but he's kind of somewhat more of a dissident Democrat in some ways. He's not really a populist, but he's also not just kind of like the mainstream. He's not like a Grover Cleveland, who was the president during the Pullman strike, who called in the federal troops, and who was the only Democratic president in the post Civil War period thus far, except for Andrew Johnson. Um, so Bryan's election is kind of, or Bryan's candidacy is significant because it represents this kind of co-opting of the populist party by the Democratic Party. And
Mm.
I won't go into a lot of detail about that again for the sake of brevity, but the wind is kind of pulled out of the sails of the populist movement in a lot of ways. A lot of the energy and organization that had developed around the movement ends up getting kind of absorbed into the Democratic Party. But there is a kind of a remnant of populist radicalism that doesn't get absorbed into the Democratic Party. It just isn't able to really kind of constitute an independent party in a significant way again after this.
Can we say the
So
same thing happens to the progressive movement too, or are they natural kind of symptoms of uh, do they naturally emerge out of the capitalist parties on their own?
that's an interesting question. So the progressive movement is kind of different. It's definitely not as much of a kind of a bottom up phenomenon in a lot of
Mm.
ways. It's much more uh, associated with, in terms of ideologically, in terms of its ideological origins, it's much more uh, a creature of kind of reformist idealism in the 1880s, 1890s. Which there's a lot of that, and some of it is around socialism. But I mentioned Henry George is kind of an idealistic reformer. Bryan is a kind of
Yep.
idealistic reformer. So there's a lot of this stuff, and there's also there's like muckraking journalists that are kind of pulling up these scandals, these kind of scandal. So there's all this kind of stuff in the air about and there's like women's suffrage activism. There's you know um, there's all kinds of activism in the air around various kinds of reforms that might ameliorate the conditions of this increasingly chaotic and sort of at odds with itself, newly forming industrial society. That's including labor issues and other issues. So progressivism sort of really coagulates in that environment as a kind of an ideological notion of something should be done, some reforms should be implemented to ameliorate these problems. But in terms of its political significance, not just in terms of, obviously these are political ideas in some sense, but to the extent that we think of progressivism as an actual political movement, it really comes out of first Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's break with the Republican Party in 1908, yeah, 1908, I think. But there's also a similar move And Teddy Roosevelt had sort of begun to implement some progressive reforms when he was president, but he really kind of makes a much more full-throated defense of this kind of progressivist package of political reforms and this kind of associated ideological vision of a reconciled society, this kind of like new political um, means of, you know, in a sense, if this transformation of society in this kind of second industrial revolution is to have, is to kind of consolidate itself, it needs a political expression of some kind. It needs some kind of political means of addressing the problems that are coming out of industrialization, and that's how Roosevelt is kind of pitching it. He even goes so far as to describe his progressivism as a kind of conservatism. In particular, he's trying to protect this society from its own self-destructive tendencies. And he says, I'll paraphrase it, at one, he has a kind of a famous letter he writes to one of his political allies, saying something along the lines of, the men of wealth and influence prefer the socialists and the anarchists to my style of conservatism, meaning a style of conservatism in which there's a kind of political consolidation of this kind of like new industrial aristocracy and the form of society it brings into existence. And then, of course, you get Woodrow Wilson, and we'll talk more about that. I think maybe in the next episode, and then later, FDR as well. So they're both kind of expressions of a similar problem. This kind of crisis of industrialization in society. But they're sort of representing almost two polar opposite trends. There's this kind of uprising of the small farmers and artisans that are kind of resisting this kind of movement towards industrialization and the associated social transformation. Um, and then you have the progressives, who are in a way kind of, again, not the reformers per se, but really the political progressives, who are embracing this change, but seeing it as requiring certain kinds of political reform to manage it, essentially. Um, and then socialism kind of gets lumped in with both, and not for there are trends of socialism that are kind of this that are associated with this kind of reformism. I'm not using reformism in the way that like Marxist sectarians often do, but in the sense of like just general seeking reforms, to address social problems. Um, and there's also a kind of somewhat backward looking tendency among some socialists towards viewing socialism or viewing the cooperative commonwealth as not so much undoing industrialization as halting a kind of movement in the direction of, again, you might describe it as like an industrial feudalism or industrial slavery or something. But the Socialist Party, and so those tendencies would be more akin to like the utopian socialists, these utopian colonies that are trying to show a different kind of society is possible and so on, which that still exists in the 1890s. It's dying out. But when you get to the people around Debs and also Victor Berger, who had been sort of on the fringes of the Socialist Labor Party, he had been a part of the Socialist Labor Party earlier, but he became alienated with it. So he has his sort of faction, of people around him. Debs has this kind of has the kind of remnants of the American Railway Union and also associated elements of the labor movement that are kind of sympathetic to, uh, you know, to that project, and sort of recognizing the necessity that comes out of the defeat of the Pullman strike, this need for a political expression of the working class. Um, you know, Debs has that around him. There's also all of this kind of, like I said, there are these remnants of the populist movement that are around. So there is a great deal of kind of energy around some kind of political expression in this moment that ends up consolidating into what becomes the Socialist Party of America. and that forms in 1900 and 1901. There's first the Social Democratic Party of America, and then the Socialist Labor Party splits, and the one of the parts of the Socialist Labor Party that split off um, join, and then that join the Social Democratic Party of America, and that becomes the Socialist Party of America in 1901. So all of that background is just to kind of give you an idea of like, this isn't just like a group of sectarians with some ideas that are like, let's form a party, right? There is this massive upheaval in society that has all these different dimensions, and all of these different elements come together around this kind of common moment of, upheaval in society, and especially among the working classes. This newly forming industrial working class, this declining old working class of artisans and small farmers. So all of that kind of comes together in the formation of the Socialist Party. And so I think that's very important to understand, that we're not talking about something that is rooted in the some people that have the correct understanding of things and then get people to join them. It's almost the opposite way around. There is this mass scale recognition of a need for something, and then some of these ideas kind of come in at the right moment and catalyze it, and that's what forms the party, as opposed to something like the Socialist Labor Party, which is essentially just an ineffectual small organization that never really has much significance on its own. And so that's just to kind of justify the prognosis of that Engels had, that I kind of read through in the last session. So that all being said, I wanted to kind of address some of these kind of criticisms from this piece that we were using as a foil, the when the Socialist Party was a factor in U.S. politics. Um, so in particular, there's these three sections of this piece that I think are helpful. And you mentioned, Amen, that divide up some of the major topics sort of concern here. One of them being organization, one of them being racism, one of them being industrial unions. I already talked a little bit about the industrial union stuff, but I'll say a little bit more about that to start. So, and this is kind of one of the most important elements of the party. So, giving it just kind of summarizing it is not necessarily going to do it justice, but there is this kind of dynamic in the party of what is the relationship of the party to the economic organization of the working class and the trade unions. Um, and you could say that the party has a sort of a left and right, to the extent that the right wing of the party is more interested in giving expression to the existing trade union movement, giving a kind of political expression to the existing trade union movement, rather than concerning itself with the kind of transformation of these unions. So less interested in what Debs was interested in terms of overcoming these kind of arbitrary or historically kind of accumulated divisions of the unions into various around crafts, and instead a kind of reforming of the trade union movement around industrial unionism. There is like there's resistance to that in the existing trade union establishment of the AFL. And there's also more generally resistant to the very idea of a political party of the working class. Um, so going all the way back to the founding of the AFL, but especially throughout the 1890s, there is this resistance that kind of becomes the kind of guiding principle of the organization to any sort of political affiliation as a kind of um, as a kind of uh, there's a kind of what would you say, nonpartisan attitude of the AFL towards all of the existing parties. And what they essentially are looking to do is to kind of keep their political options open, in the sense of, we want to be able to support whatever candidate from whatever party best reflects the interests of our members. And to that end, we don't want to bring in political conflicts outside the scope of our concern, which is organizing the workers around, their interests. Um, we want to keep that out of the organization and only have this sort of very opportunistic relationship to whatever political parties are out there. And so that becomes sort of the dominant view of the AFL with regards to politics. At least that's its kind of official line. There might be something more of a there might be a little bit more developing over time, a little bit more of a kind of modus vivendi between the trade union leadership and kind of capitalist politicians, but at least at the level of its self understanding, its kind of ideology, there is a sort of opportunistic nonpartisanism, and related to that, there is this kind of resistance to industrial unionism. There's resistance to any kind of shakeup of the existing infrastructure of the trade unions. Um, and so the kind of, you might say, the right wing of the Socialist Party is less interested in kind of shaking that up and more interested in winning them over, right? So it's not a matter of sort of going in and it's not a matter of necessarily converting the unions to socialism so much as giving the unions a political voice, so to speak. And this manifests in for example, in a controversy in the first decades of the party existence over whether the Socialist Party should itself pursue the formation of a broader labor party through some sort of cooperation with the AFL on its own terms. So, in a sense, leaving the socialist idea aside and kind of forming a broad political front, something akin to the British Labour Party. And so, like, the right wing of the party is more interested in that sort of thing. The left wing of the party, on the other hand, is more militant with its trade unionism. Um, it's much more discontented with the kind of trade union bureaucracy, the kind of conservatism of that. It's much more politically radical, although sometimes that can go so far as being too radical for any political expression whatsoever. So, like anarchism, the idea that any political expression would be inadequate, and a kind of domestication of or a kind of conservative tendency. But that's not necessarily universally the case. Obviously, real like anarchists wouldn't be in the party in the first place. But these sorts of tendencies that are kind of less interested in um, that are kind of less interested in playing ball with the AFL unions and more hostile to them, are ultimately kind of consolidated around the IWW, the international or the Industrial Workers of the World, which forms in 1905 as not an official Socialist Party organization, and in fact, Daniel De Leon of the Socialist Labor Party is involved in its formation, but as a kind of auxiliary organization broadly affiliated with the left wing of the Socialist Party. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of the IWW now, but they were generally seeking to build industrial unions and ultimately one big union. So all the workers in one union, and within industries, the organization of all the workers in an industry in one union. And they were also much more concerned with organizing the unorganized as opposed to servicing the interests of the already organized workers. So this was kind of the kind of social base or economic base of the Socialist Party's left wing, you might say. But this talk of like left wing and right wing is a little bit artificial, not because there weren't a left wing and a right wing of the party, but because the party itself was far more nebulous in its internal composition than that. To the extent that we can identify a kind of clear polarization between like a right-wing tendency, often associated with like Victor Berger being the kind of leader of the right-wing tendency of the party, and the kind of left-wing leadership. You're really identifying more kind of figures in the party leadership and in the party press than you are talking about kind of consolidated factional divisions in the party. And for that matter, it's a much more complicated spectrum than just a clear left right division would imply. I mean, even Victor Berger, I would say, is significantly more radical and even in a certain sense more revolutionary than a lot of the kind of rhetoric that you get from um, self-identified revolutionaries today. You know, he was in a sense, so he called himself, if you're familiar with Edward Bernstein, the kind of um, leading figure of revisionism or reformism in the Second International.
Oh yeah.
Um, he Victor Berger called himself the American Bernstein. Um, but that being said, he wasn't some sort of, and so he was a kind of reformist in the sense that he was interested in pursuing a program of social reforms, but in winning political office, it wasn't simply a kind of, you know, it wasn't just about the spectacle of the elections or something like that. Um, but that being said, he wasn't like anti revolutionary in some sense. In fact, so what was often understood as revolutionary politics in a sort of unrefined, kind of uneducated sense, I use that term, decidedly, in terms of like an education in the European political struggles of the labor movement of the 19th century. Um, Revolutionary didn't mean what a Marxist might mean. It meant something more like a kind of catastrophic social upheaval. More along the lines of the early 19th century kind of conspiratorial conception of revolution, the kind of Blanquiist conception of revolution, where the masses rise up and elevate some new leaders to power or something like that. That was kind of the allergy of a Berger, whereas you know Marx and Engels' perspective, certainly in the post 1848 period, is that political revolution is much more likely to take the form of some sort of um, some sort of uh, well, first of all, the working class organized as a mass political party would represent a kind of threat to the existing political formation of the ruling class. Um, but that wouldn't necessarily. Uh, but so basically, Marx and Engels' conception was that it would be the ruling class that would break with legality and suppress the working class movement by force, and that that would be the moment in which some sort of insurrectionary, uh, you know, uh, revolution in that sense would need to happen, if it needed to happen. Um, but so my point about Berger is, Berger's position was uh, not simply like an electoral road to political power, in the sense that we can expect the capitalists to invite us in when we win a majority or something like that. His point was, and he would say that if the working class isn't armed and prepared, then the elections are useless. So the whole point would be not simply having a majority winning political power through an election, but being prepared to enforce their vote with, at gunpoint if need be, if there was some sort of attempt to undermine the democratic power of the working class. And ironically, Berger himself was elected to Congress as a representative, and when he was reelected in 1918, he was prevented from taking his seat in Congress illegally because of his opposition to World War One. U.S. entry into World War One. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a much more complicated history than this kind of oversimplified view of like Victor Berger is this right wing character, etc. There's much more depth to these people and what they represented than these sorts of very dismissive gestures might make out.
Well, it's
Yeah,
an attempt
yeah,
to simplify things and to categorize for,
right.
simple-minded, Stalinist brains that are
Mhm.
like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, these are the good countries, these are the anti-imperialist countries, these are the
Right.
pro-imperialist countries. I think it's all part of that same tendency.
There is a diversity of perspectives in the party for sure. This piece makes a point of highlighting this heterogeneous character of the party's membership as like a downside or something.
Mm.
But from the perspective, like from what I would consider to be like the orthodox Marxist perspective, it's it's precisely these internal divisions and controversies and differences of perspective over different issues, not necessarily always aligning in the same way, at all times. It's in navigating these controversies and these conflicts that arise both for internal reasons and in contact with external reality that the party develops, and that the membership of the party develops, and that the broader working classes outside the party develop their political consciousness and develop their organization. And this is kind of the point that Lenin makes, is that what made the Bolsheviks able to take the lead in 1917 was that they had this long preparation in which they learned through experience the necessity of these things. It wasn't just that theory told them from the beginning, this is what you have to do. And therefore, if you simply follow the theory, you'll have the right result. Now, this is I think we've discussed in previous things, just as a side note, um, that it's not that Lenin was like an innovator in terms of Marxist theory. It was that he was able to implement Marxist theory in an extremely difficult moment that made him really significant. And that's not simply a matter of theoretical understanding, that's a matter of practical political experience and not just of him as an individual, but of the whole Bolshevik party cadre and of the broader, support for the Bolsheviks in Russian society. So, my point is that it's a process of development and of learning through experience that is important in this in the course of this political development of the working class. It's not simply a matter of having the right ideas from the beginning and not making any mistakes. The point is you have to go through this process because we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about an enormous mass of people, and that includes the organization, but also the broader masses not yet part of the organization or not yet identified with it consciously. So, the point basically being that the various elements of the party represent different elements in society, different elements in the working class, and in the broader society at large. And it's in working through the different conflicts that arise that the party grows and develops. And if anything, the problem is not that the party has these different elements in it, but that it's not able to kind of fully work through these internal conflicts until it's really too late. So I mentioned that there's this kind of right wing of the party around Berger, and there's this kind of left wing around the IWW, around Big Bill Haywood in particular. And in the center, there's two different figures. There's Morris Hillquit and there's Debs. Morris Hillquit is, in a sense, more aligned with Berger politically, but he's also somewhat more kind of consistent in his Marxism, you might say, in his Marxist theory than Berger is in some respects. But he's often seen as sort of a mediator or a center, a kind of centrist figure between the right wing and the left wing, a kind of conciliator. And Debs is also kind of in the center, but in a different sense. He's much more kind of ideologically aligned with, you might say, the left wing, not so much in terms of the rank and file left wing elements around the IWW, or there's also this kind of left wing element of these kind of radical populist or post populist farmers in the Southwest, especially Oklahoma and Texas and so on. They're kind of left wing in some respects, but maybe not in the Marxist sense. Um, Debs isn't so much a mediator as he is this kind of national figurehead. He's kind of the one figure that all of the elements of the party nationwide can kind of look to as representing them. And that's like so this piece makes a very interesting comment at one point, which is that Debs did not play the role in these internal battles that he should have. Unlike Lenin, who would use internal disagreements as a way to politically educate the rank and file of the party, Debs avoided party conflict, giving strength to the reformist right wing of the party. This resulted in confusion in the ranks rather than political clarity. And there is some truth to that. It may not really be fair to castigate Debs for a shortcoming in this respect because of how significant what he did do was. And it's not exactly true that he avoided party conflict. There were definitely party conflicts that he sort of stepped to the side or didn't fully engage in, but there were others in which he was a very full-throated participant. So it's not really fair to say that. I would say to the extent that Debs does have kind of a shortcoming, it's that he wasn't really the organizational leader that, say, a Lenin was, or in the American Party, you might say like Morris Hillquit was, for example, or Victor Berger. They were organizational geniuses, whereas Debs was a great organizer. But in terms of a great leader of an organization, he was more of an ideological figurehead. He wasn't even on like the national executive committee of the party until in the 1920s, so sort of in the decline period of the party. He wasn't really trying to constitute a coherent Marxist tendency within the party in the sense of organizing around his ideas, building internal organization around his ideas, or around his perspective. He was more trying to sort of hash out his differences before the masses of the party, and that includes on issues like racism, for example, which I'll mention briefly in a moment. But would it have been different if Debs was a different person? Certainly. But Debs was also a relatively old man by the time he was active in the Socialist Party. He had already had kind of a whole lifetime of labor activism behind him, like 30 years of labor activism behind him. And especially after 1912, but going into the throughout the first decade of the Socialist Party, um, he's sort of not looking to consolidate a kind of a tendency around himself. He doesn't have a publication with which to do so, etc. He is active and an active writer and editor and of various publications, but it's not the kind of he's not interested in kind of building a faction or something like that. Let's put it that way. And is that a shortcoming of Debs? It may be, but he didn't see the need to do that, and that's why I'm making such a big point about this kind of development of political experience and so on. All of this is kind of taking place over a decade. It's like a very condensed period of time. And so the lessons that needed to be learned simply were not really learned until it was too late. That's really the point I'm trying to get at. And also, if is just up to one person, then that's also kind of not a good situation to be in. And in that regard, you could also look at the example of Lenin in a negative light, in the sense that, not that he was the only talented or sort of brilliant figure among the ranks of the Bolsheviks or the broader RSDLP, but at the end of the day, there was really no one who was able to succeed Lenin on his own terms. In order for there to be a political consolidation in the Bolshevik Party, in the inter-party conflicts of the 20s, it ended up resulting in the kind of liquidation of the party's internal coherence under Stalin. So anyway, all of that being said, this piece, for example, says, well, if there had been more of a kind of democratic centralist organization of the party, because the various state sections of the party did have some degree of autonomy, And there's also, he mentions, there isn't like a there aren't party organs that are like official party organs, like the all of the major newspapers of the party are independently owned and so on. But the fact of the matter is, if there had been a more centralized organization, if there had been centralized party organs, they would have been under the control of Berger and Hillquit. So it's not as if that would have been a kind of, um, that wouldn't have solved the problem either.
You can really tell
Yeah,
this is written by a Trotskyist
yeah.
sect. People who are obsessed with studying Bolshevism and only Bolshevism.
And it's funny because, looking at the negative example of Daniel De Leon and the Socialist Labor Party, it was this sterile sect that was unable to get any traction. And so why was it this sterile sect? It's because it had this kind of dogmatic doctrinaire insistence on this pure Marxism. And, arguably De Leon's understanding of Marxism wasn't really orthodox ultimately. I mean, there were some deviations, let's say, but the point isn't that you so this whole idea of having theory, like having the correct theory that gives you all the right answers, is not what Marxism is about theoretically. It's about this, as I talked about last time, the meaning of this idea of Marxism as a guide to action is precisely that it doesn't give you all of the answers. It gives you a general perspective through which you can kind of get a grip on your practical circumstances. But at the end of the day, it comes down to concrete, practical judgments of situations that don't have any clear uh, immediately clear answers. There are necessary disputes. It is a necessary process of working through these complicated details in reality. And, it could turn out that, you make a misjudgment, but that doesn't mean that you don't understand Marxism necessarily. That means, okay, so the point basically being that it's not a matter of like Marxism gives you all the right answers and you just have to obey this correct theory. Marxism. So another point this article makes that I think is just kind of bizarre is that Marxist theory wasn't around, and like he says, I don't remember exactly how he phrases it, but something like Marxist theory didn't really like play a role in the party, or um, you know I can't find the exact quote, but that's just kind of ridiculous because if you look at any of the publications around the party, any of the newspapers, any of the pamphlets, any of the books that are coming out of these various presses, they are swimming in Marxist theory. Now, are there deviations? Are there confusions? Are there misrepresentations? Sure, but there is this massive enterprise. There's the party school, the Rand School of Social Science. There are all of these different educational efforts. There are lecturers going around the country. You know, there is a great deal of energy put into scientific socialism and propagating that idea and deepening that idea and applying that idea. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone that was doing that was like on the ball all the time, but the theory was everywhere. The theory was everywhere inside the party. So it's simply wrong to say that Marxist theory did not play a role. The problem is that's not enough. It's not, you can't simply rely on Marxist theory as the guide that will give you all the right answers all the time. So, on that point, I'll touch on this racism question, which I think we might have mentioned last time, but it's sort of an interesting problem to bring up, not because it's not a significant one or something like that, but it becomes much more significant in retrospect than it was at the time. Um, so I think they even mention in this article that during the lifespan of the old Socialist Party, in its first few decades, the black population in the South is beginning to migrate to the North, and become more a part of the industrial working class, and that's true. But the so-called Great Migration, as it's sometimes called, while it is beginning in the first decades of the 20th century, it
Yeah,
doesn't
that's much later.
really it doesn't really get steam until World War One, and especially between World War One and World War Two. It's only beginning in the first decades of the 20th century, and so the problem is that it poses for this question of labor solidarity between the black and white workers is not as pronounced of a problem as we might retrospectively presume it was, and I think this really shows sort of a more kind of new leftist preoccupation with the question of race than anything else. But that being said, it's worth saying, there certainly were racist elements in the party, and when I say racist, I mean at the time the so-called theory of scientific, what we now think of as scientific racism or eugenicism, was a mainstream idea in social science and in just society at large. And as kind of distasteful as that may rightfully appear to us, it was an open question for the people at the time of what exactly races are and what role do they play in forming the character of individuals and so on. And, again, I think people like Debs already could see the kind of folly of that sort of thinking at the time. And there were many others, and there were many in the party that saw these kinds of arguments about different races having different capabilities and so on, different propensities, are just not really grounded in anything substantial other than social development, which is historically conditioned more than it is genetically conditioned. So, there were elements that had these sorts of flirtations with these ideas, but it wasn't like a main aspect of the party's internal discourse on this question. To the extent that it did play a role, it was like a subordinate role. So, for example, Victor Berger was a white supremacist. He definitely believed white people were superior to black people and to Asian people, for that matter, as well. They just had a kind of innate superiority based on their genetic, whatever, their phenotype. And but what was his perspective? Now, he did have some sort of racist perspectives that come out of that. But ultimately, his perspective on the black population was that they underwent significant degradation as a consequence of capitalism, regardless of these racial questions. And that ultimately, capitalism is more responsible for the degraded condition of the black population than anything else. So, it's not this kind of albatross around the neck of the party that it's sometimes made out to be. And for that matter, it's not exactly like Berger's perspective was like the mainstream perspective of the party or something like that.
Wh- Where
Where Yeah, go ahead.
where does Lenin fit into this? Because I've mentioned in previous videos, I can't remember if it was the SPA or if it was the Communist Party that he reached out to kind of scold the Americans on their orientation towards the race question.
I would say that Lenin has a perspective on this question that is highly conditioned by the national question in the Russian Empire. And in that regard, I'm not going to say that Lenin was like wrong. I'm not familiar with what specifically you're referring to. I'm not going to say he was necessarily wrong to chastise. It would have probably been the early Communist Party that he was writing to. It wouldn't
I
have
think
been
so.
the Socialist Party. I think there was this idea in the Comintern with respect to the race question in America that it should be treated like a national question, and it should be treated like a question of, in other words, national independence. And this, takes the form a little bit later in the 20s of the Black Belt thesis, this idea that the black population concentrated in the southern United States form essentially a kind of independent nation within the United States that should strive for national independence and so on. I don't know if that's the character of Lenin's kind of treatment of that question at the time. I don't, I would have to see specifically what you're referring to, because in 1919, 1920, 1921, I don't think that that was the paramount concern of the communists in the United States. I think a far more significant question facing the communists in the United States, and certainly from Lenin's perspective, was the so-called Americanization of the party, because the party was substantially composed of Eastern European immigrants, many of whom weren't even fluent in English, let alone fluent in American affairs and so on, fully integrated into American society. And a lot of them were really attached to underground activity and illegal activity, to some extent pragmatically, but to some extent it became a kind of roadblock for the development of the Communist Party, as the kind of conditions of legal repression were waning after 1920. So, if you look at Trotsky, for example, I think you could say Trotsky, despite he had I think probably a much more robust contact with elements of what would become the Fourth International um, during his period of exile, and he didn't really have a kind of well developed understanding of the race question in the United States. And again, this is a period when this question is in massive flux. The period between 1920 1940. It's 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 the whole kind of parameters of this question are changing as the Great Migration is underway. So it's a complicated question, and I'm not going to pretend like there aren't real problems in the party around the question of there. Another major question, kind of adjacent to this one, is the question of immigration. And there is a variety of perspectives in the party on this question, um, and a major controversy in the party around whether the party should support or oppose immigration controls that have an explicit racial basis. And again, it's a minority position in the party that they would support something. Well, there wasn't ever any kind of like explicit support, at least I mean, there were members and so on that would have supported such a thing, but the closest it ever came was consideration over whether there might be merits to that or not. And then it was ultimately not embraced on a national scale in the party. The kind of final position of the party was they would only support legal restrictions to the kind of importation of labor for the purpose of strike breaking or for the purpose of contract labor. Essentially bringing people in just to work and then sending them back and stuff like that. Um, but there wouldn't be any. But the party never. The party said we will not support any kind of racial basis for immigration controls or anything like that. So anyway, these are complicated questions. There's a very deep history of these controversies in the party you could delve into. But the real point I want to make is that the controversy in retrospect on this question that we have really coming out of the new left generation's preoccupation with the race question as a consequence of the significance of that question in the 1960s and 70s, and in the course of the new social movements and so on, is that the mainstream, if there was one, the mainstream position of the party was something like the position advocated by Debs, which was, you could say, a kind of middle position in a way. So there were elements in the party that wanted to be kind of explicitly at the forefront of the struggle against racial discrimination, or the struggle for social equality, as it was called at the time. Um, who were, for example, like some of the founding members of the NAACP were Socialist Party members, like William English Walling, Charles Edward Russell, and others. And then there were elements like Berger, who had a kind of explicit white supremacist attitude, although that didn't necessarily translate into a political position per se. It was definitely not exactly an ideal position. Debs has this position that is essentially, famously, and it's paraphrasing this article, that the Socialist Party has nothing to offer the black population besides what we have to offer them as workers, which is, in other words, that we offer to treat them as equals, and as equals in the class struggle, right? Not just as equals in society or something like that, but that all workers share a common interest as workers that must unite them across all of these kinds of divisions, and that all of the kind of artificial divisions introduced into the working class are impediments to the development of the working class struggle. In that sense, it's opposed to any kind of internal racial animus or anything like that, as a kind of practical necessity for the interests of all of the members of the working class, and ultimately for the interest of humanity as a whole as a consequence of that. So Debs says this, and he says this in the course of criticizing a party resolution that highlights socialist support for the struggle against racial discrimination and so on. And Debs's point is essentially that we shouldn't be making special statements about this because it's just a necessary consequence of our position in the first place. So he's not opposed to that, but he is opposed to making special appeals in the sense of, we need to offer something other than what we have to offer them as workers. And that's a bit of a complicated, or I don't know if it's complicated, but it's a bit of a controversial position in retrospect, in light of this idea that, the socialists should have been at the forefront of some sort of civil rights struggle or something like that, which didn't really yet exist at the time, not as kind of a full blown movement. As a movement, the civil rights struggle, as we now think of it, really kind of begins in the 30s, and really gets underway in the post-war period in the 50s. So so it's a bit of an anachronistic criticism. Is my point, is that would the Socialist Party have supported a civil rights movement if there had been one of the scale of like the 50s and 60s in its time? I absolutely think that they definitely would have. I don't think there's any reason to think they wouldn't have. And for that matter, one of the most, not only one, as I already mentioned, leaders of the NAACP come out of the Socialist Party, but also like A. Philip Randolph, for example, one of the major figures of the civil rights movement of the 30s and 40s, is a Socialist Party activist, Socialist Party, member, and so on. So, anyway, what I'm trying to say as is a summary, I guess, is that there's a lot of kind of criticisms here that have some elements of truth to them in this article, and you'll see this in a lot of retrospective kind of assessments of the Socialist Party of America, regardless of where you're finding them. Like there's similar articles you could read in like Jacobin, for example, that will be an appreciation, but also have basically very similar points of criticism. And my point would be that I don't think that we're really in a position to criticize the Socialist Party of America, in the sense that we have a lot more to learn positively from it than we do negatively. And there are significant negative lessons to learn, which, I think in the next episode we'll have a more of an occasion to discuss. But the point would be that a lot of these lessons are lessons that have to be learned not just for a handful of socialist intellectuals, but for the movement as it's developing. And the idea that you can simply learn these lessons ahead of time and then just deliver them to the masses, I think is kind of silly.
It seems like the whole theme of this series of talks on the SPA, but also just this channel, what we're talking about in general, and
Mm.
the crisis of Marxism and the lack of a
Mm.
left today. So, what can Marxists or socialists do in advance, right? Like the people who are still holding on to these ideas, what use are these ideas for us today?
I'm not opposed to, for example, like studying theory and promulgating Marxist theory or something like that. I do think there is a lot of value to that. And also, more generally, I think there is a lot of value to studying the actual history of the socialist movement and the labor movement and the revolutionary movements of the 19th and 18th centuries and so on. Like, I think there is a great deal of value in studying these things and teaching these things, as a starting point, but what I think the folly is conflating that with building a political organization. I think the idea that the activity of what a lot of these groups, for example, like the IMT or former IMT, are doing is building a party, I think is very silly, because as I was trying to get at the beginning, the formation of a party in a meaningful sense is not something that you just conjure in. It's not something that you can just conjure into existence by saying we're the party. It's something that involves a confluence of circumstances in society that are beyond the control of any small group of individuals with bright ideas. And I understand that, for example, like maybe the IMT or the RCP, where they made this shift where they reorganized themselves as a party relatively recently, and they saw themselves as doing that in reaction to some confluence of circumstances in society that made it propitious to do so or whatever. And God, go with God. I wish them the best. I don't think that I don't think that's a reflection of reality, honestly, but maybe I'm wrong about that. um I think, there is an intellectual or educational role that people that have some significant understanding or significant interest in this history and in these ideas have to play.
Yeah.
that is not really being fulfilled by, by those people, or by like the organizations that they form, the sectarian groups they form. Because even when they don't call themselves parties, what these groups end up doing is kind of creating isolated cliques around around of the people that agree with them, that then separate themselves from the people that disagree with them. And they see that as like building the Leninist party in miniature or something like that. And I think the more important thing to do than finding the true believers and gathering them together into an organization is to put the ideas out there before the public in a way that they are accessible and digestible and will be considered by as large numbers of people as possible. And that might mean, there are obviously like big complicated ideas like we've been discussing today, or big complicated swaths of history that will only find a very small audience, at least at this point. But there are also kind of simpler, more concise, easier to digest ideas that need to be promulgated as well. Just the idea that the working class needs an independent political party, that idea, with no further qualifications or additions, that needs to be like booming. Like, we need to be projecting that idea out into the ether as consistently and accessibly and vigorously as possible, so that people will start to think about it, and start to give it some serious consideration on their own terms, regardless of how we want to construe it. And maybe there isn't like a really significant felt necessity for that at the moment, but when the need for it begins to be felt, if the idea isn't there to be reached for, then it's simply not going to happen, or it's very unlikely that it's going to happen. We're not operating in some kind of a social vacuum where there's just nothing. And so something might come from, this kind of like unformed chaos or something. We live in a world that is dominated by the institutions of capitalist society in such a thoroughgoing way that like almost every single moment of people's time is being caught up in the mechanisms of the machinery. So like, in order to get people's attention and get them to seriously think about and talk about and consider these ideas, is going to take a significant amount of effort on the part of the few people out there that actually give them a serious hearing. And so I think we need to be doing what they used to do, which is they used to publish, they used to promulgate their ideas, they used to go around and lecture on lecture tours. Obviously, some of these things are somewhat antiquated now. There are newer technologically mediated forms of activity that might replace some of them or augment them. But at the end of the day, we need to be getting our ideas out there in front of as large numbers of people as possible, and as consistently as possible, and in a way that doesn't restrict the consideration of these ideas to only a small number of true believers. And if I thought that's what any of these sectarian groups were doing, I would at least give them credit to that extent,
Yeah, they
regardless
have
of
their papers. They do have
they have their
their own.
papers. But who the fuck is reading these papers? I mean,
Their
so
members and
right.
their friends and family that they make by them.
And a lot of these groups who they're really pitching their ideas to are like students, like college students in particular. And they might try to reach the working class, but uh, how successful they are in that, I think, is dubious at best a lot of the time. So, I think there's a great deal of kind of energy and activity already invested in some of these, what are effectively propaganda groups, that believe themselves to be something more than that, but they aren't really good at doing the propaganda. I don't mean propaganda in the negative sense. I mean it just in the sense of promulgating ideas, putting ideas out there in the public for people to consider. That's, I think, what we need to do, personally, based on studying how these things developed in the past. I could be wrong about that, but I'd be curious to hear any dissenting views on that. I just think if it comes down to a kind of construal of Marxism as this kind of mechanical formula that needs to be imposed on social reality, I just think that's completely inconsistent with what Marxism actually is. And so there's a kind of contradiction there.
Right. So if any of my former comrades are listening in and want to give some dissenting views on these topics and
I have a feeling there's a lot of them that would say, well, that is what we're doing, or we're doing something like that, or you're wrong about this, but to this extent, we're doing that, or whatever.
yeah.
And maybe they're right, but I haven't seen it.
Next episode in this series on the SPA, we'll be talking about
Decline and
decline. Yeah,
fall.
decline and fall. Yeah.